alaikum, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at HAVOC. Usually I present in a public way and enjoy interacting with people and meeting people. Many of the people who attend these sessions are our colleagues and friends, and it's a good time to meet them and touch base with them. But under the current circumstances, we need to keep our social distances. So thanks for Hacker Academy for arranging this and keeping us safe, and at the same time allow us to share our knowledge in this field with our colleagues. And also special thanks to Khalifa from Malkov for being persistent and requesting me to present in this event. A quick walkthrough of what we're going to be presenting. We'll give a quick introduction about myself and the session outcomes. We'll talk about your organizational requirements, the landscape that you will need to deal with for work from home, security controls that you need to consider, an approach, and then we'll talk about risk re-evaluation of the entire situation. I would like to talk about me in the perspective of this session. So what I would like to bring to this session from my previous experience is one, I worked in different sectors. I worked in the industrial sector, I worked in the telecom sector, and now I'm working in the government sector. So this gives me a bit of an exposure on what does work from home mean to different sectors, and what is their requirements and what are their challenges. The other part I would like to bring through this presentation or this session is my previous experience as being a crisis lead in the telecom. And I was also a member of the National Emergency Plan for Telecom, which we got exposed and participated in preparing for a natural crisis. How do we respond? How do we be agile during that and make sure that the service is not interrupted and the business is having an agility? And now also we need to talk about work from home. So, this is not something new. The current understanding of that is teleworking, remote access, and bring your own device. Nest has a standard on that, so nothing new here, but what changed actually? So what really changes, we have a big disruption. So if a volcano erupts in a specific city, that's a major disruption. Businesses, people, governments have to readapt, and COVID-19 is a similar scenario. It's a major disruption to people at a personal level, organizations, governments, and based on this disruption, people are required to work and change the way they operate on daily basis, which is introducing the work from home scenario in a different way. People tend to look at this in a traditional way, so they will think of this crisis or this disruption as a before state and an after state, and in between you are in the during state. So as of now we are in the during state, and we're trying to cope and ensure that we respond and make sure the business is resilient and everything is working. The other thing I want to also describe here is when such a disruption happens on different sectors, some sectors are still required to go and work because of their criticality. So imagine if you're in an industrial company, you still need to send people to work and attend to the equipments and the factory operating to ensure that everything is safe. So the measures that will be applied there are different. They will ensure that they apply more social distancing. They will ensure that they apply more health measures. Maybe they have two different shifts, 2 weeks of each shift, they don't interact with each other. But we will not be talking about that in depth. We'll be talking about the scenarios where we can work from home and what is the security challenges that you might face in that. Before we jump into it, I also would like to talk about what's the mindset during these scenarios. So if we start, when this started, people had the mindset that this is a 2 weeks thing and it will be over with. It extended to 2 months and it will be over with. But in reality, this is now becoming a long crisis, and it will continue to be. And usually business continuity and resiliency is coping with an event that might take a day, 24 hours, a week, But once you stretch the event for 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, you really need to start changing the way you operate, which as a security team, you need to support the organization to adapt to this situation. So during this scenario, you might change your approach to a more tactical approach, especially if many of the things you implemented are not equipped or coped to deal with this situation. Another thing, you will be dealing with a lot of new requirements and new technologies, so you need to really start understanding them and applying security measures on them. And above all, health will be the main driving factor. So whenever someone approaches the security team or the infrastructure team and requests a solution, it's in the mindset of we are deploying this to ensure the health and safety of our staff, our organization, our country. So you're a partner in that to ensure the safety of your people, your family, your country, not only against COVID, but also as you deploy these solutions. As a security team, you have the responsibility to ensure that the introduced threats and risks with these systems are adhered to and are addressed, because you want to protect people against the COVID virus, but you also want to protect people about cyber threats that might be introduced as you maneuver during this situation. So as a mindset, you need to really think of it as what is before, but what will be the new business as usual. So many of the organizations and governments might operate in this mode for a longer time, or they might see efficiencies and benefits of these solutions deployed and might adapt to them. Because let's face it, this is a major disruption. It's not only disrupting the way we work, it's disrupting the way we think and how much impact it has on the economy and how people will reintroduce some of these mechanisms to ensure the resiliency of their business. So let's jump into the landscape. So what's the landscape to consider when you work from home? So of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, this will be a different landscape depending on the sector you are in, but we will try to talk in general about many of them and share the experience that we saw. And just to, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, what I'm presenting here is not specifically what we did in Smart Dubai, and this is not our design and infrastructure. No, this is a collective knowledge by me, my team, and other colleagues who interacted with me during this event, and we shared notes, and I'm collecting it here to share it with you. So initially, you need to really understand the landscape and what is the business driver to these use cases. So a simple scenario is, who are your employees and what do they need? So if your employees require email and a portal, and this is what they require to get their job done, so great. Work from home is complete. These guys already have these equipments. But what about, if your organization or in the specific sector that you have specific rules or policies where power users can only operate within a secure environment, whether it's on-site, and if they are off-site, they have less privileges. So you have like power users who access ERP, CRM, so they access more sensitive information and you require different controls. And of course, after that, you have administrators who will access your main systems and do changes. You have developers. Many developers, as of today, they go to the office, do their job there. They have access to development environments, QA environments, and the general norm is let's go work together, interact, get the job done. So most of these systems are accessible on-site in the data center, and remote connectivity to it is a bit limited. Another scenario, and maybe this is more towards the banking, the telecom, people who have a big dependency for their service on contact centers. So these contact centers have agents, bigger numbers of them, and they are required to go to a service center where they log in and attend to clients. Some of these requirements might require them to leave their mobile phones outside, so they might not take pictures of the sensitive data that they are exposed to on their screens. So to address that situation from a work from home environment is very challenging. The other scenario is if you have agents who attend to calls of customers and then they pass it to L2, so that would be a less complicated scenario, but they will need to still access their VoIP system like a call manager from home or remotely, which is not usually the case. I'll come to this specifically later. The network team is under a new challenge. So usually if you lock yourself out of a core switch, you will need to get in the car, drive to the data center, access the console cable, and get it done. Usually under normal circumstances, that is not an issue. But in COVID-19, during the day, and 80% of your staff is at home, that will become a major incident and everyone will be locked out, and you need to really find a way to have a faster approach to connect to your console cable and get things up and running, or maybe connect to that console remotely. And of course, we have our vendors and partners that connect to us. You need to consider whether they're using your devices or now you have to allow them to connect through different medium. And on top of all that, during this scenario, you are introducing new services that could be cloud-based. So in a way, this is the landscape from a user perspective and systems coming in the back end. To add a dimension to this, of course, people will ask me more about what is that red circle there? That's an amazing solution that can do all these tasks, you know, like I can connect everyone through a single solution. Great, but that's not the reality. We end up introducing VPNs, which could be legacy. We introduce systems to allow deployment of virtual applications like Citrix environments. We might need to deploy virtual machines, VDIs to address specific scenarios again. And as we talked about the network team, in telcos and in some industries, having an out-of-band connectivity to your critical infrastructure might be a requirement. And how do you address it, and what kind of security controls would you apply on it? Because under certain circumstances, these are not allowed to be accessed easily, and you might need to now address it to give them access. Another dimension that we need to look at is, are the people connecting using your managed devices? And if so, they're using a specific operating system, and you need to ensure the security of the endpoint by making sure that your data, device management, and access management are in place. And of course, if it's an unmanaged device, I would call this by now a traditional approach to have either a BYOD scenario or solution, or by deploying specific apps to address specific needs. For example, you might be giving access to suppliers to connect to your backend system and to do certain activities. You might have an Apple app or Android app that facilitates that for them, and you don't need to allow them to connect through a managed device. They can come through their unmanaged device and utilize your application. So as this landscape starts to change, anti-DDoS becomes a bit more critical. So the initial scenario is you have 20% of your workforce on-site, or 80% on-site and 20% off, or maybe even less. So if someone launches a DDoS attack on your web page, that will not directly impact your day-to-day operation. People will work in the office not noticing it. But in this case now, where 80 and sometimes 100% of your working force are off-site, a DDoS attack might be extremely painful or impactful at your day-to-day operation, because most of your staff will not be able to connect to your systems, which will render them out of service. And to think of this as, how can I have a central way of managing it without making it complex? Because as your different users connect through VPN, Citrix, VMware, they might have different identities, they might have different connection settings. So you need a common factor to be able to track them and scope them. So a good practice is to have a quick understanding of deploying a central identity manager. Some entities or some sectors already invested in that to reduce the complexity and to give them better visibility. And on top of that, you can build more controls. So this will simplify the complexity of remote connectivity, because if you need to track who is who on multiple of solutions, and it gets more complicated as you track them on your on-site systems, and then you need to also correlate that with what is their identity on your cloud environment. It gets really complex really fast to all the security teams. But of course, if you deploy central identity management, you can really integrate cloud services to it and make it act as a single authentication gateway, and then you can apply more controls to elevate the security needs. So whether if you're accessing a critical system, you can step up and say, I need to now implement multi-factor. I can now implement PAM. And based on that, you'll get a lot of flexibility to apply these controls. From many people's point of view, this should be considered as a core or base security block that you build on top. And we will get into the details of that in the next slides. Of course, as you introduce things to the work from home scenario, whether it's a cloud service environment or whether you're introducing, example, a collaboration tool on site, you need to consider what other security measures you need to introduce to that solution, whether it's data security, whether it's any other scenarios that you need to implement. It will all depend on what your organization needs to introduce and what other security controls you'll need to address. Just to jump to the next slide, this is an example of implementing single sign-on or a centralized identity. I just wanted to share this to show that it's not that complex and it's achievable. So this is the standard way of integrating, example, with Office 365. You will log in with your account, you will utilize their multi-factor authentication, and you will access the service. But that doesn't mean you cannot apply your own solution. In Smart Dubai, we already started testing this and we are there. So again, you can apply and access Office 365 cloud, but then because you are integrating with your identity management system, it will forward you to your local authentication system and your identity, and there you can apply a different mechanism. Example, for our case, we applied UAE Pass to authenticate and to ensure that you have a second multi-factor using this tool. So of course this is subject to your organization, but if today you have a central authentication and you have a multi-factor authentication, don't complicate the environment, just use what you have, make sure you integrate it. And to put this in an approach, especially when you go after and utilize a cloud security or a cloud service in these scenarios, which is a faster way of doing it, and as you know, many industries had to go there. Example, the school industry, and this wasn't in their scope this year, and they had to really adapt and shift to an e-learning solution or remote school solution. So to keep it simple, maybe we'll take a couple of examples to see how can you apply a protect, detect, response to these cloud solutions, and then you can see how do they fit your security design. So let's take an example like Azure services. As a protection mechanism, we just discussed it. You can apply single sign-on, authentication at your site, and you can apply multi-factor authentication. But then you can say, all right, what's happening on that cloud? Can I detect it? And you would start looking into, can I get the logs from the Azure site? The answer is yes, you can get these logs integrated with your current ecosystem and reduce the complexity. And then you might say, all right, what's my strategy to respond? So now I can protect that environment, I can detect what's going on, but what do I do to respond? You need to see if that cloud provider or cloud service has a capability to allow you to respond to these incidents depending on what they are. So in this example, I just kept this here, like you have session control and you can apply some information protection on the data being shared over that cloud. If we want to apply the same scenario to other solutions being provided, so let's take another example like Slack. Can we apply the central identity management and multi-factor authentication to Slack? If you go to the enterprise version, yes, they have integrations that can be done. And do they have a monitoring API? Yes, they have that. And they have other security controls that can help you in response. What I'm trying to say here is, if you are under this pressure of implementing a solution to support the work from home scenario, you need to really be tactical and see that you can apply these controls in a very fast-paced way and then integrate it with your overall strategy and make sure that it's secure. Now, I will not go deep into what are the regulations of using cloud services. Each sector will have different rules and there's a different risk acceptance process that needs to be followed to achieve that. So to summarize the approach, we talked about a lot of things and we are attempting to simplify this complex environment, and I hope I'm achieving that, but it's a bit complex and we're trying to simplify it as much as possible. So if we want to make it simple now, we need to think of security as services to your infrastructure. So identity access management, multi-factor authentication, security monitoring, that should be really thought of as a service that any new system that you introduce to your network should utilize it and be adhering to that standard that you already deployed. So that is one. Another thing you need to really consider, what security controls did you implement and what is their effectiveness post the COVID-19 scenario and people working from home. So example here, if you look at the managed devices, device management. So traditionally, many of the IT teams will wait for people to come back to the office, get their PCs updated, get their antivirus updated, and we're good. In this scenario, people are not coming back. So you need to make sure that your device management is effective, that you can push these updates, you can update your group policies, you can update your EDRs. You also need the telemetry to come back to you, so you can detect if your staff, if your employees at home are being targeted or being compromised, or did they execute something on their systems, and how do you respond and support them in these scenarios. And of course, you need to reconsider introducing controls depending on the scenario you're facing. So if you have unmanaged devices and people need to access your backend, what other measures would you introduce to secure that scenario? Now, I purposely didn't talk about a specific point. I kept it to here because it will lead us to the next slide, which is re-looking at the risks, which is, if you see it on the screen, I'll try to go to the laser pointer just. So if you look here, I purposely now added the secure web gateway as an example. So traditionally, many of your managed devices, when they go off-net, they access the net without going through a secure web gateway. Traditionally, a secure web gateway is on-site. Some organizations require their staff to go back on-site and then access the internet. Some don't. But now, under these circumstances, this is something that you need to really pay attention to, as an example, especially if they are at home and new attacks are being introduced, especially in COVID-19, and you see a lot of campaigns being pushed to compromise people and to push them to go to malicious sites and to execute, malicious code. You might need to reconsider how to deploy your secure web gateway strategy. So whether you deploy a front-end server or decide to have a cloud-based secure web gateway to allow the users to go through it securely. So the reason I'm discussing this is to lead to the next slide, which is how do we look at risk assessment after COVID-19? You need to re-look at it because the landscape changed, and you need to re-look at the controls that you deployed. And let's take some examples here. The easy one is DDoS. So as we discussed before, what is the before status of DDoS? So before, we would say a DDoS attack sometimes is low impact to the day-to-day operation. It might be high impact on a specific service, but it doesn't impact your entire organization. After COVID-19, the DDoS is high impact because it will impact everything. So you need to re-look at that control, consider its effectiveness, and see how useful it is. Let's take another example. Many of the security solutions or gateway solutions you deploy, people have that understanding that they are secure by design and they are, appliance-based and it's hard to compromise. But that's not the reality. So let's take an example of CVE that I'm displaying on the screen. This was the Citrix NetScaler CVE, which had remote code execution on a secure gateway. So imagine this 0-day comes out now, you would be at a much higher risk, at a much higher impact, and you need to address it in a different approach. We discussed the secure gateway. Is the scope and control effective, especially if people are not coming back to the office? So you need to reconsider these things from your risk acceptance and risk approach. Endpoint protection. During COVID-19, some staff were maybe before COVID-19 using desktops and PCs. Now they are on laptops. So the probability of losing your laptop is higher because you gave it to much more of your staff. And your sensitive data might be on that laptop. So you might need to reconsider your endpoint data security, whether you're encrypting them and it's a time to re-encrypt and make sure everything is secure. This is just food for thought. Do we need to relook at, example, our home networks? I mean by that, employees at home. So, example, a red team can go and park in front of my house and try to compromise my Wi-Fi network, and then get into my system and back to my backend. Is that a scenario that we need to start thinking about? Do we need to put more controls or requirements on our staff and what kind of networks they need at their home? Or by design, should we introduce a more secure access to our backend regardless of the solution they use from home, whether they connect to a secure Wi-Fi or not? And last but not least, the effectiveness of the control. So example, if we are giving virtual desktops to trusted users, in many cases today, you might not be implementing controls on the device. For example, introducing EDR on a virtual desktop because it's under a development team that builds it up, do something, and collapses it. But under the current circumstances, you might be giving this to different user groups that you need now to reintroduce the security controls to these virtual machines and maybe isolate them in a different group. So what I'm trying for you to think during this slide is, as we are implementing changes and introducing systems, you need to take a step back and relook at your risk assessment. Usually the governance team will look at risk assessment once during a year, or if there is a major structural change in the department, or this is another example. If there is a major disruption to the business, major changes happening, you need to invoke your risk assessment and look at the new risks and new threats and ensure that the management are aware and controls have been implemented to address them. So as I'm reaching to I'm keeping track of the time, so Rami will not flag me, so I have still 3 minutes. So final thoughts. Your organizational requirements will be different. So I hope with the input I gave in these slides, you can go back and look at them from that perspective, look at what the business needs and how do you go and address them. Look at the landscape. Have you already implemented, if you already have a strategy and implemented many of these controls and now you can leverage it to maneuver through the COVID-19 situation, excellent. But if you need to go tactical, I hope what we shared today will allow you to take tactical actions, but with that strategy in mind. So over the long term, whatever you apply now will fit in that overall strategy. Security, base and building blocks. You really need to start considering security as a service within your infrastructure. So if you want to rapidly deploy services and new systems, they can just adhere to it, plug into, and move on. They don't need to redeploy new security solutions to each and every service as it's being deployed. And as we discussed, have a relook at your risk assessment to ensure that new risks and new threats are relooked at. And yeah, you will need to repeat that over and over as this situation is evolving. So with that, I would like to thank the attendees and the panelists, and I would like to open the slides for any questions.